Genesis, a look at variances in the details of the creation story. For this video, our source is the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, a new translation of the Holy Scriptures according to the Masoretic texts, the Jewish Publication Society 3rd edition, copyright 1992. The text called Genesis in the Torah shows some variances in the details of the creation story and raises some interesting points to take notice of and consider. There is the opening account of 6 days of creation and 1 day of rest. In the opening account, creation is started and completed in 7 days, and this account of creation finishes at Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. A varying account follows, beginning in the second half of Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, and continuing in 2:5, 2:6, and onward from there. This varying creation account shares some different details that the initial opening story does not contain. To draw sharper lines of distinction, the opening story is referred to from here on out as the first creation account, and the rest of what follows is referred to as the second creation account. Variance number 1. Time sequence and man's home. Differences regarding creation of man and where man was to dwell. In the first creation account, male and female are both created on the last day, day 6 of God's creating. They, male and female, are created after the trees and plants and all vegetation of the earth had sprouted on day 3. In the second creation account, man is created before trees and plants and vegetation had sprouted and grown in the garden. Also, the second account later tells the story of a woman being created from the rib of the man. The first account makes no mention of this. The main points of this variation are: 1. The first account and second account timelines of creation do not match regarding creation of man and creation and sprouting of vegetation. And the first account states vegetation sprouts all over the earth, while the second account states vegetation sprouts in the garden. Variance number 2. No restriction versus restrictions. In the first creation account, we find that God places no restrictions on the male and female. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fertile and increase, to fill the earth and master it and rule the fish, the birds, and all living things that creep on the earth." God gives them every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth to eat for food. In the second creation account, we see that God placed man in a specific area, Garden of Eden, and restricted the man from eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In the second creation account, only the man is commanded by God to not eat of it, as the woman had not yet been created at the time God commanded the man to not eat that fruit. We also see in the second account that God gives man the vegetation in the garden, in contrast to the vegetation of the whole earth described in the first account. In the second account, God has the man give names to all kinds of living creatures, and whatever the man called them was their name. In the second account, there is no mention of the man having rule over anything. Man only names the creatures. This is different than the first account, where man is to rule and master all creatures of earth. In the second account, we also see additional restrictions issued by God, where the man and woman are later expelled from the entire garden and prohibited from ever entering it again, so that they would not have access to the tree of life any longer. They were made to live their lives on the earth outside of the garden. The main points of this variation are that in the first account there are no restrictions placed upon the male and female by God. In the second account, we see two restrictions: the command to not eat a certain fruit and the restriction of ever entering the garden again. We see in the first account, man is to rule and master the creatures of all of the earth. In the second account, God brings the creatures to the man so he can see what the man would name them, and that would be their name. But no instruction is given about ruling or mastering. In the first account, God gives the male and female every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth to eat for food. In the second account, God gives the man all trees in the garden, except one. In the first account, we see man in relation to the whole of the earth versus the contrast in the second account where we see man in relation to the garden. Variance number 3, vegetarian to carnivore. This one we cover may be a variation or an evolution due to the circumstances the story tells, but nonetheless we see a change in man's diet as instructed by God. In the first account, God gives the male and female and all other living creatures plants for food, specifically. In the second account, in chapter 9, where God is blessing Noah and his sons, God says, "Every creature that lives shall be yours to eat, as with the green grasses I give you all of these." We see mankind's diet has changed from only vegetation to incorporating all living creatures. God seemingly prescribed a vegetarian diet for mankind in the first account, and later on changed the prescription to include a carnivorous mankind in the second account. Variance number 4. God says something would happen that didn't happen. As mentioned before, in the first creation account, there are no restrictions placed on the male or female by God. In the second account, we see God commands the man to not eat of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God says to the man, "Of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as far as the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you will die." When the man and the woman ate the restricted fruit, what we see happen was that they did not die as soon as they ate. The man, later known as Adam, Hebrew for man or mankind, lived until 930 years old. What we also see happen is that the man and woman perceived. Their eyes were opened, now knowing the difference between good and evil, good and bad, like God's. But regarding the eating of the fruit, there was no instant death, no dying as soon as they ate it. What we see happen is that the man was made to toil the ground and labor for food until the day he dies, and that the woman was inflicted with childbearing pain and suffering by God. But instant death did not come, as God had said it would. I have heard an interpretation that explains that it was a spiritual death, that they died. This would indicate that man and woman's relationship with God in the garden was only a spiritual one. But the Genesis text does not say that. And what I see about that in the second creation account and beyond it is that God's presence was a physical presence, and God's dealings with the man and woman were also physical. For example, Genesis says the man and woman were able to hear the rustling of the Lord God moving about in the garden, and they hid from God so he wouldn't see their bodies. In later Torah texts, such as the Exodus, the Lord God walks through encampments or inns in certain Bible versions, encountering people physically. These points of interest and variances make me wonder, did the same author write both of these accounts, or did different authors contribute to the creation story and thus tell it differently? Why do the accounts vary? Why is there not consistency and congruency throughout the creation story in Genesis? Why does the God of the first account seem to be of a different character than the God we see in the second account? Is the author or authors describing the same God or telling us a story about two different gods? Let us make man in our image. How many gods are responsible for the creation of man? And which of those gods is being referred to when Genesis uses the word God?